You already know wishing isn't the part that changes anything. Not really. There's something else that moves first. Something quieter. Something you don't talk about. And you felt it. This isn't about trying harder. It's not about believing more. It's not about repeating words until they sound convincing. It's about that subtle moment when something inside you shifts and the world seems to rearrange without force. You've noticed it before. A period where nothing seemed to move, even though you wanted it badly. You thought about it, you imagined it, you hoped, but nothing changed. Then something inside you softened, or snapped, or settled. And suddenly, without struggle, circumstances aligned. People responded differently. Opportunities appeared. Timing felt natural. You didn't push. You just were different. And reality followed. For a long time, it's easy to think reality responds to desire. But if that were true, wishing would be enough. It never has been. There's a deeper layer beneath desire. A layer you rarely examine because it feels too obvious. Identity. Not the one you describe, not the one you defend, the one you assume, the one you don't question. There's a version of you that wants change. And there's a version of you that quietly expects things to stay the same. The second one usually wins. Not because it's stronger, because it feels familiar. And familiarity feels safe. You can want something deeply and still hold an identity that cannot contain it. That's the part no one points out. And you felt the tension of that contradiction. You felt yourself wanting a different life while still reacting like the old one is permanent. That internal split. That's where reality waits. Pause for a second. Notice something simple. When you truly decide something about yourself, not externally, not for show, but internally, the world shifts faster than expected. Not always dramatically, but noticeably. The tone of your voice changes, your posture shifts, your timing alters, your perception sharpens, and people respond to that version of you, not to your wish, to your state. There's a quiet honesty in recognizing that. It removes the drama, it removes the fantasy, it leaves something far more intimate. Consciousness doesn't respond to what you beg for. It reflects what you assume to be true about who you are. You don't need to force that idea. You've lived it. Think about a time when you felt completely secure about something. Not desperate, not uncertain, just settled. Notice how reality mirrored that calm. Now think about a time when you felt small, doubtful, half convinced. Reality mirrored that too. Not as punishment, as reflection. Around minute 3, you may start sensing that this goes deeper than goals or success. It touches something more foundational. We'll return to that. Because identity is rarely loud. It's quiet assumptions. It's the way you expect conversations to go before they begin. It's the subtle thought that says, this always happens to me. It's the invisible baseline you carry into every situation, and that baseline organizes perception. Perception organizes response. Response organizes outcome. You don't see reality clearly. You see it through yourself, and yourself isn't fixed. That realization feels both relieving and unsettling, because if identity shapes the field you experience, then wishing for a different field without shifting identity is like trying to change the mirror without moving. Nothing happens, not because the world is against you, because the reflection is accurate. You've probably noticed how some people seem to move through life effortlessly. It's not that they wish better, they assume differently. Their identity includes the possibility of things working out. They don't chase confirmation, they expect alignment. That expectation isn't loud, it's stable. And stability bends time in subtle ways. Time feels longer when you resist who you are. It feels fluid when you inhabit it. There's a version of you that already moves differently. You've glimpsed that version. Maybe during a period of confidence, or after letting go of something heavy. Or in a moment when you stopped caring how it would unfold, and things unfolded. But it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't magic. It was alignment. Alignment isn't effort. It's coherence. When identity and desire match, reality compresses. When they conflict, reality stalls. You don't need to analyze that deeply. You've experienced it. Sometimes you think you need more clarity, but often what you need is honesty about who you're being. Because identity isn't chosen once, it's rehearsed daily, in small reactions, in subtle thoughts, in the way you interpret silence. Every time something doesn't go your way, identity whispers, see, this is who we are, and if you agree, even silently, the field organizes accordingly. But here's the quiet part. Identity isn't fixed. It feels fixed because you've practiced it, like posture, like tone, like habit. And habits feel natural until you step outside them. There's a reason change feels uncomfortable at first. It's not because it's wrong. It's because it doesn't match your rehearsed self. That discomfort isn't danger. It's unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity often precedes expansion. You don't collapse reality through effort. You collapse it through assumption, through the quiet decision about who you are now, not who you hope to be, who you are. That distinction matters. Wishing is future-based. Identity is present. Reality responds to present state, not imagined future. And that's why wishing feels slow, because it places change somewhere else. Identity brings it here. There's a subtle collective shift happening right now. Individually, quietly, people are starting to sense that the old effort-based model feels exhausting, trying to force outcome, trying to convince reality, trying to override reflection. It doesn't work long term, because reality isn't resisting you. It's mirroring you. That realization isn't meant to pressure you. It's meant to free you. You don't need to control everything. You need coherence. Notice how different you feel when you stop trying to become and simply embody, even for a moment. That moment contains more power than weeks of wishing. Around minute 10, something will connect more clearly, not intellectually, but experientially. We'll let it surface naturally, because this isn't about techniques. It's about recognition. There are parallel versions of you that exist as potential, not in some dramatic sense, in a practical one. Different identities produce different perceptions. Different perceptions produce different choices. Different choices branch into different paths. You don't jump timelines, you shift self, and the path adjusts. Sometimes the only difference between two outcomes is the identity you carry into them, but subtle and profound. You've been taught to focus on belief, but belief without embodiment stays abstract. Identity is embodied belief. It's belief stabilized into behavior and expectation shapes the mirror. Look at your life not as a reward system, not as punishment, but as a reflection field. What does it show you about who you've assumed yourself to be? Not what you say you want, who you are being. That question isn't meant to criticize, it's meant to illuminate. Because once you see identity clearly, you stop blaming circumstances. And you stop chasing fantasies. You start adjusting the only variable that matters, state. State isn't emotion alone. It's deeper. It's the baseline frequency of self, the quiet conviction underneath reaction. And when that baseline shifts, reality feels like it collapses inward. Opportunities appear faster. Conversations unfold smoother. Timing aligns. Not because you forced it, because you became coherent. There's something humbling about realizing you were never waiting for the world. You were waiting for yourself, waiting to feel worthy enough, capable enough, certain enough. But those feelings don't arrive before identity shifts. They arrive after. You don't feel like the new version first. You decide into it. And the feeling catches up. That's the part that feels risky, because it requires letting go of the comfort of the old reflection. Even if that reflection isn't ideal, it's familiar, and familiarity feels safe. But safety without expansion feels stagnant. You've sensed that tension, the quiet boredom beneath routine, the subtle frustration beneath comfort. It's not dissatisfaction with the world, it's misalignment with identity. Suffering isn't punishment, it's feedback. Feedback that who you're being no longer matches who you sense you could be. That sensing isn't random. It's awareness expanding. Consciousness isn't static. It explores through identity. And when one identity feels complete, restlessness appears, not to hurt you, to invite shift. Around minute 20, the earlier threads may converge into something that feels obvious in hindsight. We'll allow that convergence without forcing it, because identity isn't adopted through pressure. It's recognized through resonance. You don't become someone else. You remember a version you forgot you were allowed to be. Forgetting is part of the design. If you always remembered your full potential, experience would feel flat. Contrast creates depth, but you're not meant to stay lost in contrast. At some point, awareness catches up. You start noticing pattern. You start sensing that wishing hasn't been the missing piece. You start recognizing that every time reality changed, it followed a shift in self, not in strategy, in self. That recognition changes how you relate to time. You stop waiting. You start embodying. Time compresses around certainty. It stretches around doubt, not because time changes, because perception does. Perception is the gateway. You don't experience the world directly. You experience your interpretation of it. And interpretation arises from identity. Change identity and interpretation shifts. Shift interpretation and reality feels different. It's quieter than you expected, less dramatic, more intimate. And here's something you might quietly acknowledge. You already know who you are capable of being. You've seen flashes of it. Moments of clarity, moments of boldness, moments of grounded calm. Those weren't accidents. They were previews of an identity you haven't stabilized yet. And stabilization is simply repetition, living from it consistently, not forcing it, allowing it. There's a reason the phrase, who you really are, resonates. Because deep down, you sense that you've been playing smaller roles, safe roles, predictable roles, roles that match old reflections. But identity isn't meant to be rigid. It's fluid. And fluid identity collapses reality faster because it doesn't resist expansion. If this resonates, you may notice that the resistance you felt lately isn't external. It's internal hesitation, a quiet reluctance to release an old self. Even if that self no longer fits, that hesitation is understandable. Identity feels like survival, but it's not fixed survival. It's adaptable. Consciousness isn't trying to trap you. It's exploring through you. And when you shift, the field shifts. Not because you commanded it, because you embodied it. You might be noticing right now that this isn't about goals at all. It's about alignment. Alignment between who you sense you are and who you act as daily. When those align, wishing becomes unnecessary. Reality moves without being chased. There's something deeply relieving about that. It means you're not behind. You're not broken. You're not unlucky. You've simply been rehearsing an identity that produced a predictable mirror. And now you're aware enough to choose differently. Not loudly, not publicly, internally. That's where collapse begins. Not with fireworks, with assumption. And as you sit with that, you may feel a quiet question forming. If reality reflects who you are, who have you been assuming yourself to be? Not the answer you tell others, the one you tell yourself in silence. You don't need to resolve that question now. Let it echo. Let it breathe. Because this conversation isn't ending here. It's continuing internally. Maybe later today you'll catch yourself reacting in the old way, and you'll notice it. That noticing is awareness. Awareness is the doorway. There's a reason the idea of parallel realities feels familiar, because you've experienced them emotionally. Different days feel like different worlds. Different states produce different interactions. That's not fantasy, that's identity shifting the field. And perhaps the deeper realization isn't that wishing changes nothing. It's that you were never meant to wish. You were meant to remember. If this stirred something quiet in you, you'll recognize it without needing to explain it. Some people call that consciousness expanding. Others call it alignment. It doesn't matter what it's called. It matters that you feel it. There's a continuation of this awareness in the pages of parallel realities, not as instruction, but as reflection. But even without that, the recognition is already active. You don't need more information. You need integration. And integration isn't forced, it settles, like identity, like self. If you find yourself reflecting on this later, noticing subtle shifts in perception, that's natural. If you feel like sharing what version of yourself has been waiting quietly beneath the surface, that recognition might resonate with others who sense the same. No pressure, just reflection. Because what you really are has never been hidden. It's just been assumed smaller. And now, you're beginning to feel the difference. Not through wishing, through being. And that difference is already reorganizing more than you can see, quietly, naturally. I'll leave you there, not with a conclusion, but with a present. Because this isn't something you finish understanding. It's something you start inhabiting, and once you do, reality doesn't need convincing, it responds. There's something subtle happening as you sit with this. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's more like a quiet reorganization behind the scenes, because once you see that wishing was never the mechanism, you can't fully go back to believing it was. You can still hope. You can still imagine. But something inside you now knows that imagination without embodiment is just rehearsal. And you're done rehearsing. You may have noticed this pattern before. There were times when you visualized a different future with intensity. You pictured the relationship, the freedom, the stability, the recognition. But underneath those images, there was a subtle tension. A quiet thought that said, I don't know if that's really for me. And that whisper outweighed all the desire. Not because it was stronger, because it was truer to your current identity. Desire pulls forward. Identity anchors now. Reality always organizes around now. That's why some changes feel delayed. They aren't delayed in time. They're delayed in self. You can't experience what you don't yet allow yourself to be. An allowance isn't effort. It's acceptance of a new baseline. There's a difference between wanting confidence and being someone who naturally moves with it. The first feels like effort. The second feels like familiarity. And familiarity is what collapses resistance. You don't fight for what you assume is yours. You move toward it calmly. Notice how different your body feels when you assume something is possible. Breathing changes. Posture shifts. Your perception opens instead of scanning for threats. That physiological shift isn't small. It's identity stabilizing. The world responds to stability, not to desperation. There's a reason calm certainty feels magnetic. It isn't because it's loud. It's because it's coherent. Coherence simplifies the field. And when the field simplifies, reality organizes quickly. You felt moments like that, maybe not constantly, but clearly. A conversation where you didn't overthink. A decision you made without second guessing. A risk that felt strangely obvious and things aligned. Not because you forced them, because you weren't divided internally. Division slows collapse, coherence accelerates it. When you say you want something but internally question whether you deserve it, the field splits. And split signals create delay, not as punishment. As reflection, the mirror can only show what is stable. This is where identity becomes practical, not abstract. It's in the tiny ways you define yourself. I'm bad with money. I always mess this up. People like that don't choose me. It never works out. Those aren't just thoughts. They're identity statements. And identity statements program perception. Perception programs choice. Choice programs path. It's quiet, but consistent. You might start noticing how often you reinforce the same version of yourself in conversation. Even jokingly. Especially jokingly, humor reveals baseline belief. If you constantly repeat an old identity in subtle ways, the field doesn't know you've outgrown it. It reflects it, because that's what you keep confirming. There's a moment, and you felt it, where you stop explaining yourself. You stop apologizing for your ambition. You stop minimizing your clarity. You simply occupy space differently. That moment doesn't feel loud. It feels grounded. And grounded identity collapses possibilities inward. It doesn't chase. It attracts by coherence. This isn't about pretending. It's not about forcing a personality shift. It's about recognizing which parts of you were rehearsed for safety and which parts were always authentic. Sometimes the version you think is realistic is just conditioned caution, and the version you think is unrealistic is actually your natural self before limitation. That tension between safety and expansion, you've been living there for a while. It shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as waiting for confirmation. But confirmation never comes first. Embodiment does. When you become someone who naturally assumes good timing, you notice opportunities faster. When you become someone who assumes connection, conversations deepen without effort. When you become someone who assumes capability, decisions feel lighter. You don't need to convince yourself constantly. You simply move, and the mirror adjusts. There's something deeply stabilizing about realizing the field isn't random. It's responsive, not to wishful thinking, to identity. This doesn't mean everything becomes instant. It means everything becomes coherent, and coherence reduces friction. You stop interpreting neutral events as rejection. You stop interpreting silence as failure. Your perception softens. And when perception softens, reality feels less hostile. Not because it changed first, because you did. There's a quiet collective awakening happening, not dramatic, not chaotic, where individuals are starting to see that effort alone isn't the answer. They're exhausted from trying to force outcomes. They're beginning to sense that alignment feels lighter, that perception matters more than pressure, that state matters more than strategy. You can feel that shift too. It's subtle, but steady. And it's personal, because when you stop identifying as someone who has to struggle to earn everything, struggle reduces. When you stop identifying as someone who is always overlooked, visibility increases, not magically, naturally. The field reflects the assumption. This is where time becomes interesting, because when identity shifts, events that seem distant feel closer, not because the future moved, because you aligned with it. The version of you that already has what you desire doesn't wait anxiously. It moves normally. And when you stabilize that version internally, reality doesn't need to catch up. It reorganizes. You might notice that some of the things you once desperately wanted don't feel as urgent anymore. That's not giving up. That's identity evolving. Sometimes when you become someone who doesn't need something to feel complete, it arrives effortlessly. Not as a reward, as a reflection of stability. There's a deep difference between chasing from lack and moving from wholeness. Lack contracts perception, wholeness expands it. An expanded perception sees more paths, more options, more timing. The collapse of reality isn't about control. It's about narrowing infinite possibility into lived experience. Identity is the filter that narrows it. Change the filter, the image changes. You don't need to tear down the old image aggressively. You simply stop reinforcing it, stop rehearsing it, stop narrating it. And slowly, quietly, it dissolves. Around this point, you may start sensing that this isn't about achieving something external at all. It's about stabilizing a different self. And once stabilized, external outcomes follow like natural consequences, not rewards. Consequences of coherence. You've probably had days where you woke up feeling slightly different, more centered, more certain, and the entire day unfolded smoothly. No major changes, just flow. That's identity stabilizing for a moment. Imagine if that baseline became consistent, not because you forced positivity, but because you genuinely shifted who you assume yourself to be. It doesn't require affirmation, it requires honesty. Who have you been unconsciously loyal to? An old story? An old label? An old version that once protected you? You don't need to criticize that version. It served a purpose, but you're not required to keep living it. There's a quiet courage in letting identity expand, because expansion feels uncertain at first. You don't have references, you don't have proof, but proof only appears after embodiment, never before. That's the leap. And it isn't dramatic, it's internal. It's the moment you stop bracing for disappointment, the moment you stop pre-rejecting yourself, the moment you stop assuming effort must equal exhaustion. When those assumptions dissolve, the field reorganizes. You start noticing different reflections, different responses, different timing, and you realize nothing external was withholding from you. You were simply matching an old baseline. There's something profoundly empowering about that realization, not in a loud way. In a steady way, it means you are not at the mercy of randomness. You are in relationship with reflection, and reflection is neutral. It mirrors state. If you carry the identity of someone waiting to be chosen, you'll wait. If you carry the identity of someone who naturally belongs, belonging feels immediate. The mirror doesn't argue, it agrees. The world agrees with who you assume you are. An assumption isn't conscious most of the time, it's embodied, but embodiment can shift. You don't need permission to change identity, you only need awareness. And awareness is already active. That's why this feels less like learning and more like remembering. You've sensed it in moments when you outgrew environments, when old conversations felt small, when old reactions didn't feel authentic anymore. That wasn't dissatisfaction, that was identity expanding. And expansion demands a new mirror. The discomfort that sometimes follows isn't failure, it's recalibration. When you change internally, the field adjusts externally. There may be a brief period of instability, not because something went wrong, because something is reorganizing. If you stay coherent during that transition, the new baseline stabilizes quickly. If you panic and revert to the old identity, the mirror resets. It's not punishment, it's consistency. You can't inhabit two identities at once for long. One will feel heavier, one will feel lighter. The lighter one usually feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity triggers doubt, but doubt doesn't mean wrong. It means new, and new requires repetition, not of words, of being. You don't collapse reality by trying to change the world. You collapse it by stabilizing a version of yourself that matches a different reflection, that's quieter than you imagined, less mystical, more precise. You are not here to beg reality into shape. You are here to decide who you are within it. And once decided, the mirror has no choice but to respond. Not because it's obedient, because it's reflective. And as this settles, you might feel something subtle shifting already. Not outside, inside. A slight recalibration of posture. A softening of old narratives. A quiet clarity about who you've been pretending to be. There's no rush. Identity doesn't need to be declared. It needs to be inhabited. And you're already closer than you think, because the moment you recognize the mirror, you stop blaming it. You start adjusting the image. Not forcefully, naturally. That's where collapse begins, not with wishing, with being. And once being stabilizes, reality doesn't need persuasion. It aligns quietly, consistently, and you'll know. Not because someone tells you, because it feels different, grounded, certain, like something finally fits. We'll let that settle here for a moment, because the deeper layer isn't about changing who you are, it's about realizing who you've been all along. There's something almost unsettling about realizing how quietly identity has been steering everything. Not loudly, not obviously, just beneath the surface. You don't wake up and declare who you are every morning, you assume it. An assumption becomes atmosphere. Atmosphere shapes perception. Perception shapes what feels possible. And what feels possible shapes what unfolds. You've been living inside an atmosphere of self-definition. So naturally, everything you experience has matched its climate. That doesn't mean every detail was predictable. It means the tone was, the baseline was, the pattern was. And now something inside you is noticing the baseline, not judging it, just seeing it. That's important. Because once you see the baseline, you stop mistaking it for reality itself. You realize it's just a filter, and filters can change. There's a quiet strength in understanding that you don't have to fight your circumstances. You don't have to argue with the mirror. You don't have to beg the field. You only need to shift the assumption you carry into it. Not verbally, internally. You've probably sensed this before in subtle social moments. When you walk into a room feeling uncertain, People respond cautiously. When you walk in grounded without performing, the room feels different. The people didn't change. You did. And the response followed. This applies everywhere. Not just socially, financially, creatively, relationally. Your identity creates a subtle gravitational pull. Not mystical, psychological, energetic in the most grounded sense. The self you assume organizes your attention, and attention is selective. You don't see everything. You see what matches you. If you assume opportunity is rare, you overlook half of it. If you assume connection is difficult, you misinterpret warmth as coincidence. If you assume growth requires suffering, you brace for pain even in ease. The field reflects the expectation, but here's the part that softens everything. You're not wrong for having lived as the old identity. It served you. It helped you navigate earlier versions of yourself, but you are not required to stay loyal to it. Loyalty to an outdated identity feels like stagnation. You may have felt that stagnation recently. Not dramatic frustration, just subtle misfit. Like your current reflection no longer feels accurate. That misfit isn't failure. It's expansion pressing against limitation. And expansion doesn't ask for permission. It invites embodiment. There's a version of you that already feels natural in the reality you say you want. That version isn't struggling to convince anyone. It isn't anxiously checking for proof. It moves normally, breathes normally, chooses normally, because to that identity, the experience is ordinary. This is where everything becomes simpler. You don't need to chase extraordinary outcomes. You need to normalize them internally. When something feels normal to your identity, resistance drops. And when resistance drops, reality reorganizes quickly. That's the collapse. It isn't fireworks. It's friction dissolving. Friction only exists between who you are and what you're trying to experience. Remove the mismatch, and friction disappears. The field doesn't resist coherence. It aligns with it. There's something deeply stabilizing about this realization. It removes desperation. It removes comparison. It removes the need to outperform others, because this isn't competitive, it's reflective. No one else can live your identity for you. No one else can stabilize your baseline. That's intimate work, quiet work. And you've already started it simply by recognizing this pattern. You might notice in the coming days moments where you catch yourself reacting from the old assumption. Instead of criticizing it, observe it. Observation alone begins the shift. Because awareness disrupts autopilot. And once autopilot loosens, identity becomes flexible. Flexibility allows new versions to surface, not forced, not rehearsed, just allowed. There's a reason this feels less like instruction and more like remembering, because you've already experienced identity shifts before. Think about who you were 5 years ago, 10, even 2. The things that felt impossible then might feel ordinary now. Not because the world transformed overnight, because you did. Your baseline shifted, and the mirror followed. This process never stopped. You just weren't consciously watching it. Now you are. And that awareness alone accelerates coherence. There's no rush to redefine yourself loudly. Identity doesn't require announcement. It requires consistency. Small choices aligned with the new baseline. Small reactions that feel lighter. Small assumptions that feel more expansive. Over time, those small stabilizations compound. And suddenly, the world looks different. Not because it changed first, because you did. Around this final stretch, something may be settling into place, not as an idea, as a feeling, a subtle clarity. That wishing was never the mechanism. Being always was. And you don't need to force being. You need to stop resisting it. Stop postponing it. Stop assuming you have to earn it. Who you really are isn't waiting in the future. It's waiting beneath the identity you've been rehearsing. And once you relax the rehearsal, it surfaces effortlessly. There's a quiet awakening happening globally. Not loud, not chaotic. Individuals are beginning to sense that reality isn't random. That consciousness is primary. That the mirror is honest. And that suffering often signals misalignment, not punishment. You're part of that subtle awakening, not because you believe something new, because you're recognizing something old, a truth you always sense but couldn't articulate. That reality doesn't collapse around desire, it collapses around identity. And identity is not fixed. It's fluid, alive, responsive. The more fluid you become internally, the faster the field adjusts. Rigidity slows time, flexibility bends it. And bending time isn't dramatic. It feels like synchronicity, like timing, like ease. You don't need to control the collective. You don't need to solve the world. Your field is enough. Stabilize your identity, the reflection follows. And if you ever wonder why some shifts feel sudden, almost immediate, it's because the internal decision was complete, not halfway, not doubtful, complete. Completion collapses delay. Half decisions stretch time. You've lived both. You know the difference. Complete identity feels calm. Half identity feels anxious. Calm collapses. Anxiety loops, not because anxiety is wrong, because it signals division, and division creates friction. As this conversation settles, there's no final instruction, no checklist, no dramatic closing, just a quiet awareness. If reality has been reflecting who you assumed yourself to be, and if that assumption is flexible, then everything you experience is closer to coherence than you thought. You don't need to wish harder. You don't need to force belief. You don't need to convince the mirror. You only need to inhabit the version of yourself that feels internally aligned, and once inhabited, the field reorganizes naturally. There may be moments after this where you feel an almost imperceptible shift in posture, in tone, and expectation. That's identity recalibrating. Let it. Don't rush it. Don't analyze it to exhaustion. Just notice. Notice how conversations feel. Notice how timing feels. Notice how your perception subtly widens. That widening is awareness expanding. And awareness is the doorway to parallel versions of self. Not in fantasy, in lived experience. Every choice stabilizes one version over another. Every reaction reinforces a baseline. You're always selecting quietly, and now you're selecting more consciously, non-aggressively, gently. If something in this felt familiar, like a memory surfacing rather than information arriving, that recognition is enough. You don't need to declare it. You don't need to prove it. You simply carry it. And maybe in the quiet moments later, you'll feel the difference between wishing for a different life and becoming the version of you who naturally lives it. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, like gravity adjusting, like atmosphere shifting, like a mirror clearing. Who you really are was never hidden. It was just layered beneath assumptions. And now you're seeing through them. There's nothing to finish here, nothing to resolve. This isn't a conclusion. It's a continuation, because identity isn't a statement, it's a state. And states evolve. You'll feel this again tomorrow, in small choices, in quiet reactions, in the way you interpret events. And each time you choose coherence over rehearsal, the collapse becomes smoother, less effort, more alignment. You don't need to chase reality. It's already responding. You just needed to notice what it was responding to, and now you have. That's enough. The awareness continues from here, quietly, internally, naturally.